remember the first day I walked into that office bright-eyed, hopeful, and honestly, proud. I had worked hard to get this job. Late nights, certifications, interviews upon interviews. When the offer finally arrived, it felt like my life was finally aligning with everything I had envisioned. The company was one of those polished glass tower places, clean, modern, buzzing with the type of energy that makes you feel like you're stepping into your future. I could practically see myself growing here, building a real career, proving myself. People smiled as I walked in. The receptionist welcomed me. The security guard greeted me like I belonged there. And then, there was him, my boss Eric, tall, sharply dressed, the kind of man who walked like everyone owed him space. He shook my hand with a smile too perfect to trust, and said, "Welcome to the team. I'm sure you'll do great, as long as you listen." I didn't think much of that last line at the time, just shrugged it off as a manager trying to sound authoritative. If only I knew how closely that sentence mirrored who he really was. The first week, he seemed fine. Charming even. He'd joke around lightly, introduce me to people, walk me through systems. But slowly, very slowly, the cracks started showing. It began with the small jabs, a sarcastic comment when I asked a clarifying question, a passive remark during a meeting about new people slowing things down, a subtle eye roll when I offered a suggestion, little things I tried to ignore, things I blamed on myself. Maybe I was nervous, maybe I was taking too long to adjust, maybe I was being overly sensitive. But then the little things became louder. One morning, I sent him a report he requested. He called me into his office, glass walls, everyone outside able to see everything. He didn't even look up from his laptop when he said, "This is wrong." My heart dropped. "What part?" "Most of it," he said casually, still typing. "Do it again. Don't make me regret hiring you so early into the quarter." I felt heat crawl up my neck, embarrassment mixing with confusion. I had followed every instruction he gave. When I politely asked what was incorrect, he sighed dramatically and said, "If I have to explain the basics to you, I'll be here all day." That was the first time the humiliation stung, but not the last. Over the next few weeks, his temper got shorter, his comments harsher. He started calling out my mistakes in front of others even when they weren't mistakes at all. It was like he was waiting for me to slip, waiting for something to use as ammunition. Still, I tried to stay strong. I needed the job. I needed the stability. I told myself it was temporary, that he was just tough, that he'd eventually see my work and respect me. But that illusion shattered during a team meeting that I will never forget. We were in the conference room, big oval table, screens on every wall, the entire team present. I had prepared a small proposal, something Eric asked me to put together. I stayed up late the night before refining it, rehearsing it, making sure it was professional. When he called my name, I stood up, plugged in the laptop, and began presenting. 30 seconds in, he interrupted. "Stop." The room froze. I blinked, confused. "Is something wrong?" Eric leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirking like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Did you seriously think this was good?" he asked loudly. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others kept their eyes on the table. "This looks like a high school project," he added, chuckling. "I mean, honestly, this is embarrassing. For you, not me." My throat tightened. My hands shook. The walls felt like they were closing in. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but he kept going. "You know what? Forget it. Just sit down. I'll do it myself. Everyone, let this be a lesson if you're not competent. Don't volunteer for things you can't handle." There it was, the humiliation, the laughter from a couple of his favorites, the heat burning behind my eyes, the feeling of wanting to disappear. And, in that moment, 25 of the way through this part of my story, something inside me cracked. If you find this story good, please like and subscribe our channel. It's free for you but helps us a lot to keep sharing real stories like this. The rest of that meeting passed in a blur. I sat there, silent, broken, staring at the table, while Eric presented my work as if it was his own idea, restructuring it mid-sentence to make it seem like he was fixing my mess. By the time we left the room, I could barely breathe. My chest felt tight, my throat ached, and every step felt heavy. I walked to the restroom, locked myself in a stall, and cried quietly into my sleeve. But even through the tears, one thought anchored itself into my mind. This isn't normal. This isn't tough management. This is targeted humiliation, and I wasn't imagining it. My coworkers avoided my eyes, avoided conversations, avoided being seen with me. Some looked guilty, like they wished they could say something. Others looked relieved that it wasn't them being destroyed. Eric, he enjoyed it. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just a bad boss. He was a predator in a suit, someone who built his power by tearing others down. And something inside me shifted that day. Not anger, not revenge, not yet, just awareness. Sharp, quiet, observant awareness. Because humiliation may break your spirit for a moment, but it also awakens something powerful in you. A desire to understand, a desire to see the truth, a desire to push back not loudly, but strategically. And I didn't know it then, but that meeting, that single moment of public humiliation, was the beginning of his downfall. Because while he thought he had broken me, he had actually awakened the version of me that would destroy him with one email. The morning after the meeting, the office looked the same, sounded the same, smelled the same, yet somehow felt completely different. I walked in with my badge clipped to my shirt, coffee trembling in my hand, pretending everything was normal, even though my insides were still twisted from the humiliation of the day before. People looked at me the way you look at someone who's been in an accident. Quick, sympathetic glances, followed by turning away to fast, as if eye contact might drag them into the wreckage with me. No one said anything. Not a single "Hey, you okay?" Not even a casual, "Rough meeting yesterday, huh?" Just silence. That silence hurt more than Eric's voice. At my desk, I stared at my monitor, pretending to read emails when all I could hear was was his voice echoing in my skull. This looks like a high school project. Sit down. I'll do it myself. If you're not competent. The more I replayed it, the more helpless I felt. It was like drowning slowly while everyone pretended not to notice. Then, 10 minutes into the day, an email arrived. From Eric Subject. Reminder, it said, let's not repeat yesterday. Stay in your lane and focus only on what I assign you. No more independent initiatives. No greeting. No explanation. No feedback. Just pure condescension wrapped in a fake managerial tone. I stared at the screen, jaw clenched so hard it hurt. He hadn't just embarrassed me, he was making it official. Boxing me into the lowest corner of responsibility. Making sure the whole team saw me as the weak link. And the worst part, I didn't know how to fight back. I wasn't in a position of authority. I was the newcomer, the probationary employee, the person who should be grateful for the opportunity. So I obeyed. For the next few days, I kept my head down, completed the basic tasks he assigned, and walked on eggshells around him. Every time I sent him something, my stomach twisted like I was waiting for a punch, and the punches came. Small ones, sharp ones, cutting ones, a snide comment when I asked for clarification, a loud sigh when I handed him a file, a sarcastic finally when I completed something ahead of time, and always within earshot of at least 3 people. It wasn't just about correcting me, it was about performing dominance. One afternoon, when I dropped off a printed report he needed, he said loudly, you know, I've had interns with more initiative. I froze. He didn't even look up. You need to toughen up. This is a real company. A few people glanced over. I felt my face burn, but I forced a neutral expression. Okay, I managed. He smirked like he enjoyed watching dignity leak out of me drop by drop. That night, I sat in my car in the parking garage long after everyone else had left. The concrete ceiling above me echoed with the sound of my breathing, shaky and uneven. My hands gripped the steering wheel as if holding onto it could anchor me in place. It was the first time I allowed myself to face the truth. I wasn't just struggling with a demanding boss. I was being psychologically dismantled by someone who enjoyed it, but the helplessness only deepened from there. The next morning, I walked into another trap. He called me into his office, gestured to a document on his screen, and asked sharply, did you update the spreadsheet? Yes, yesterday, I said, keeping my tone calm. And you didn't think to double check your numbers? My chest tightened. I triple checked them. If something's wrong, I can fix it, he scoffed. You didn't triple check anything. Look at this. He pointed at a highlighted cell. Explain this number. I leaned in. The number wasn't mine, Eric. This isn't the version I worked on. Are you saying I changed it? His voice rose, sharp as a blade. I'm saying it's not the one I saved. So your first instinct is to blame me? No. He stood up suddenly, pushing his chair back. Get out. I don't have time for excuses. I stepped back, heart pounding. But before I left, he delivered the final blow. And for the record, don't ever accuse me of altering your work again. That's not how things operate here. He said it loudly. Loud enough for the team to hear. Loud enough for them to think I was disrespectful or irresponsible or unprofessional. That was his game. He pushed me into a corner and then painted me as the problem. When I reacted, the helplessness became suffocating. Over the next week, every day felt like walking into a battlefield without armor. I barely slept. I barely ate. My anxiety spiked every time my phone vibrated with an email notification. I dreaded mornings, dreaded meetings, dreaded hearing my name. I tried to talk myself through it. He's just stressed. It's temporary, maybe. He treats everyone this way. You can't afford to lose this job. Just survive the probation period. But deep down, I knew something had shifted in me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't me being dramatic. This wasn't new employee jitters. This was abuse. One evening, I overheard 2 co-workers whispering near the break room. He's doing it again. One said quietly, yeah, poor thing. The other whispered, you can tell he enjoys it. They fell silent when they saw me. One of them forced a sympathetic half smile. The other looked down, ashamed. That tiny exchange confirmed everything. People knew. People saw. People just couldn't or wouldn't do anything. Because Eric was protected. He was liked by upper management. He delivered results, even if he stepped on people to get there. And in corporate America, results bought immunity. The worst moment came at the end of a long Wednesday. I was sending him a file he needed before he left for the day. I walked into his office, placed the printed sheets on his desk, and said softly, here's the final version. He looked at it, then looked at me, then dropped the papers into the trash bin beside him without breaking eye contact. I don't need it anymore, he said. My throat tightened. But you asked for it. Are you questioning me again? I swallowed hard. No good, he said coldly. You're here to follow instructions, not waste time. I nodded slowly and walked out, feeling like a piece of me snapped off and stayed behind in that trash can along with the work he discarded. That drive home was the longest of my life. I felt small, diminished, like someone unplugged the light inside me and replaced it with nothing but exhaustion and doubt. But somewhere, beneath all of that buried deep, I felt the slightest spark. Not anger. Not yet, but the beginning of awareness. A shift, a flicker. The moment helplessness becomes unbearable, something inside a person quietly decides, enough is enough, and even though I didn't know it then, that flicker was the very first breath of the storm that would one day take him down. With one email, the shift didn't happen all at once. It started with tiny moments, little cracks in Eric's perfect facade that I wouldn't have noticed if he hadn't pushed me to the point where every detail felt suspicious. When someone humiliates you regularly, you start observing them the way prey watches a predator. Not out of curiosity, but survival. One of the first red flags appeared on a Thursday morning. I arrived early, hoping to get ahead of the day. The office was quiet, lights still warming up, and the soft hum of air conditioning filled the empty space. As I passed by Eric's office, I noticed something strange. His door was slightly open, and he was inside arguing with someone on the phone. His voice was low, but tense, nothing like the confident, smooth tone he used when belittling me publicly. "No, I told you I can't do that," he whispered harshly. "If anyone finds out, it's over." My breath stalled. I knew I shouldn't linger, but the fear he planted in me mixed with curiosity kept my feet rooted to the spot. I said, "I'll fix it. Just stop calling me," he snapped, then slammed the phone down. I flinched. Moments later, he stepped out and spotted me. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flooding his expression. For a split second, I thought he might accuse me of eavesdropping. Instead, he forced a smile and a natural, stretched one and said, "You're early." I nodded. "Just trying to finish yesterday's numbers." "Good," he said, adjusting his tie. "Stay busy." And then he walked away. The whole moment lasted less than 30 seconds, but the feeling lingered. Something was wrong. He wasn't just a bully, he was hiding something. The second red flag came during lunch 2 days later. I was sitting alone, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the tightness that had become a permanent knot in my chest. A co-worker named Daniel sat at the table behind me, talking to someone quietly. I wasn't trying to listen, but when I heard Eric's name, my ears sharpened automatically. "Look, I'm telling you," Daniel whispered. "He's not as clean as he pretends." My heartbeat quickened. The other person lowered their voice. "You mean that thing from last quarter?" "Yeah," Daniel said. "HR didn't find proof, but come on. Everyone knows he doctored those numbers. No way he hit those targets without manipulating something." I froze. Manipulating numbers? Before I could react, Daniel's phone rang and the conversation ended abruptly. They both left the break room, and I just sat there, heart racing, mind spinning. It wasn't just me. He had a pattern, a history, and the pieces slowly started forming a picture. The third red flag came a few days later, when I accidentally walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. It happened late in the evening, when most people had already left. I stayed behind to finish one of Eric's urgent tasks. My head throbbed, but I didn't want to give him another reason to lash out. I printed a report and went to place it on his desk. His office was dark, but not empty. He was there, hunched over his computer, muttering angrily to himself. His face was inches from the screen, eyes frantic. I paused in the doorway. He didn't notice me. What I saw next made my stomach twist. He was inside a restricted folder one only managers were supposed to access, editing a financial report. Not adding notes, not reviewing, changing numbers. He typed quickly, then deleted, then retyped, flipping between spreadsheets. Every few minutes, he looked over his shoulder like someone was watching. His movements were nervous, paranoid, and suddenly, the puzzle pieces clicked together inside my mind. The dramatic outbursts, the constant scapegoating, the need to humiliate someone publicly, the strange phone calls, the accusations he threw at me before I even spoke, the mistakes he said I made when I knew I didn't. He wasn't just a bully, he was covering something up, and he needed a fall guy. That realization didn't come like a lightning bolt, it came like a slow wave of cold water running down my spine. It made sense, too much sense. He wasn't attacking me because I was incompetent. He was attacking me because I was new, because I didn't know his patterns, because I didn't owe him loyalty, because I wouldn't help him manipulate numbers, because I wasn't trained to play along, because I was the easiest person to discredit first. And once he destroyed my credibility, he could pin anything on me. My heart pounded so hard I thought he might hear it. I left quietly, placed the report on another table, and walked out before he noticed. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't spiral. For the first time since joining that company, I felt something new, clarity. And clarity opened the door to something even stronger, anger. Not explosive anger, not screaming anger, but the steady, calm kind that sits in your chest like a weight. The kind that whispers, "This isn't your fault. You're being played." That's when I made my first move. I started paying attention, not to defend myself, to understand him. I observed everything: his moods, his timing, his expressions, who he emailed, who he avoided, who he charmed, who he snapped at. I noticed he got nervous whenever someone from upper management asked for updates. I noticed he always volunteered to fix someone else's report before it went through. I noticed the way he always made sure to criticize me loudly, but praise himself quietly. I started saving emails, documenting instructions, keeping duplicates of everything I submitted, screenshots, dates, times, not because I had a plan, but because I knew I would need them. Still, the helplessness didn't disappear. If anything, it grew heavier, because now, I wasn't just dealing with humiliation. I was dealing with the knowledge that the person destroying my reputation was also manipulating company finances, and I was trapped between two impossible realities. If I did nothing, he would eventually blame me for something big. If I spoke up without proof, he would destroy me before anyone even listened. So I kept my mouth shut and my eyes open. The next major red flag came unexpectedly. Eric was in a rush, stressed out, pacing his office while yelling at someone on the phone. I wasn't close enough to hear everything, but one line reached me like a dagger. "No one can know what happened last year." I'm still recovering from that. Last year, HR, numbers, rumors, cover-ups. My stomach twisted. Whatever he did then, it was big. Big enough that he was still scared. Big enough that he needed a scapegoat more than ever. And that's when I knew. This wasn't going to end on its own. He wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to have an epiphany. He was going to keep pushing me deeper into a hole until he had enough leverage to bury me completely. And the only question left was, would I let him? That night, as I sat alone in my apartment staring at a blank wall, something inside me solidified. The helplessness wasn't gone, but it wasn't alone anymore. It had a new partner, resolve. resolve. Quiet, calculating, patient resolve. Because if he wanted a fall guy, if he wanted someone to blame, if he wanted someone to destroy, he picked the wrong person. And soon, very soon, he was going to realize he made his biggest mistake. The real shift happened quietly, on a random Tuesday afternoon when the office felt too still, too controlled, too staged. Eric walked around acting like he owned the air we breathed, strolling from cubicle to cubicle with his fake grin and his loud footsteps. Every time he passed me, he made a point to glance at my screen, as if checking that I wasn't messing anything up. He wasn't just bullying me anymore. He was monitoring me, watching me too closely, too aware, too suspicious. And that's when I knew. My time was running out. Whatever he was planning, whatever disaster he needed a scapegoat for, it was coming soon. So I stopped reacting, stopped responding emotionally, stopped giving him anything he could use. Instead, I started building the one thing he didn't think I had, a trap. Not revenge, not anger, not pettiness, just pure self-preservation, wrapped in cold logic. But traps require patience, strategy, silence. So I played the long game. I started by organizing every piece of evidence I'd quietly collected. His emails, his contradictory instructions, the times he changed reports after hours, the screenshots of numbers he replaced, the timestamps proving he altered files he blamed me for. I even kept notes of his verbal attack dates, times, locations, what he said, who witnessed it. I didn't know which piece would matter most, so I kept everything. Then I watched him, his habits, his schedule, his tells. I noticed he always arrived 15 minutes early on Fridays, probably to adjust weekly reports before sending them to management. I noticed he kept a private folder inside his company drive, hidden under a boring name like MISC data, but he checked it constantly. I noticed he became paranoid whenever someone asked to see original numbers, and slowly, I began to understand how his whole operation worked. He manipulated performance. Results, he inflated department. Success, he pocketed bonuses based on false data. And he covered it all by shredding blame onto people too vulnerable to fight back. A psychological paper trail, a financial one, a moral one. He had built an entire career on deception, and all it would take to bring him down was truth. The strange part was, once I saw his cracks, I felt less afraid. It didn't remove the stress or the dread, but it gave me something I hadn't had since day one: control. Even if just a small piece. Still, part of me wondered if I was exaggerating. If I had built him up as some monstrous mastermind. If maybe I was reading into things too deeply. That doubt disappeared the day I found the email. It was almost midnight. I had come back to the office to retrieve something I forgot, a USB drive with backups of my own work. The building was mostly dark, but the glow from my cubicle screen illuminated the room just enough to make it feel eerie. As I grabbed the USB from my drawer, I noticed a faint light coming from Eric's office. His computer was still on. Normally, I wouldn't have gone near it, but something tugged at me, a feeling I couldn't explain. I stepped closer, quietly, and when I glanced at his screen, my entire body froze in place. An email thread was open, a long one, between Eric and the company's outsourced financial consultant. The subject line was innocent, monthly adjustments, but the content wasn't. Line after line showed him instructing the consultant to reallocate margins, smooth out discrepancies, and align projected targets retroactively. It was corporate language, hiding blatant fraud, and worse, at the bottom of the thread, I saw a draft he hadn't sent yet. A message to upper management, a message blaming me. He wrote that I was unfocused, unreliable, uncooperative, that I had altered files without approval, and that an internal audit may be needed due to inconsistencies in work performed by the new hire. My chest tightened so violently, I couldn't breathe. He wasn't just preparing to scapegoat me. He was almost done. 2 more keystrokes, and he'd send a lie big enough to ruin my entire career. But he hadn't sent it yet, because he didn't have the guts to finish the lie without one more thing. A push. He needed me to screw up again. To react emotionally. To panic or slip. To give him one final mistake to weaponize. But I wasn't going to give him anything. I took a picture of his screen, then another, then another. My hands shook, but my mind was crystal clear. For the first time, I understood exactly what I had to do. It wasn't enough to expose him. I had to make sure he couldn't twist anything back onto me. I had to make the truth undeniable, unavoidable, unspinnable, and I knew exactly how to do that. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and opened a blank email. Not for him, not for HR, not for my coworkers, for the board, the highest level, the ones who had no loyalty to Eric, the ones who cared about one thing only: liability. And Eric was about to become a very expensive liability. I typed slowly at first, choosing every word with surgical precision. I stuck to facts, dates, proof. No emotion, no bitterness, no accusations without evidence, just the truth, cold, clean, lethal truth. And halfway through writing it, I inserted your channel's CTA line: calm, subtle, perfectly placed. If you find this story good, please like and subscribe our channel. It's free for you but helps us a lot to keep sharing real stories like this. Then I kept writing. I attached every screenshot, every timestamp, every piece of data showing manipulated numbers, every email where he contradicted himself, every proof of him blaming me for his edits. By the time I finished, the email was a time bomb, but I wasn't ready to send it. Yet, timing mattered. I couldn't send it now, when he could swoop in with a counter-narrative. I needed a moment when he was vulnerable, exposed, unprepared. And then it hit me. The quarterly review meeting. The one where performance results were evaluated. The one where executives asked tough questions. conference, the one where numbers mattered more than any excuse. That was the moment he would be at his most confident and his most susceptible, because the numbers he planned to present, I had proof they were fake. So I scheduled the email. Friday, 9:05 a.m. 5 minutes after the review began. Not 9:00, not 9:10, not during a break, right when he was already speaking, right when every executive in the room would see it at the same time, right when he couldn't escape, explain, or spin. A perfect trap, built from the pieces he gave me himself, and I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, knowing that in a few days, the man who humiliated me would finally face something he couldn't manipulate. Truth. Friday morning arrived with an almost tangible tension in the office air. It wasn't loud or obvious, but you could feel it in the way chairs scraped quietly, the way fingers tapped nervously on keyboards, and the way the coffee machine hummed, like it knew something big was about to happen. I arrived early, as usual, but my steps felt different this time. Calm, focused, patient. I had already set the trap, and now all I had to do was wait. Eric came in later than normal, as if he needed extra time to psych himself up. He carried his laptop under one arm, his tie slightly crooked, his hair combed just right to look confident, like a king entering a court. He smiled at a few people on the way in, waving his hand as if greeting peasants, and then finally reached his office. I watched him closely, noting his posture, his gait, his expressions. Everything about him screamed arrogance, the same arrogance that had fueled months of humiliation for me. The quarterly review meeting started on time. Executives filed into the room, laptops and tablets in hand, discussing minor updates with mild excitement. Eric, as always, strutted in a few minutes late, acting as though everyone had been waiting for him specifically. He was nervous, I could tell, but not enough to stop his act. He sat at the head of the table, cleared his throat, and began presenting the numbers for the quarter. He smiled at the room like a performer on stage, oblivious to the performance about to unfold. Minutes into his presentation, the first subtle shifts began. One of the executives, a senior woman named Helen, raised her eyebrow at a chart he had proudly displayed. Another executive, Mark, leaned back in his chair, scrolling through numbers on his tablet with a skeptical frown. I kept my head down, heart steady, watching carefully as his confident narrative began to wobble. Then, at precisely 9:05 a.m., the email I had scheduled minutes before the meeting hit inboxes across the board. It landed in the executive team, HR, and even the department heads. I stayed at my desk, pretending to type, my fingers lightly brushing the keyboard, heart thundering, but my face calm. A few seconds later, the first notifications pinged on the conference room devices. I could almost imagine the subtle confusion spreading as the executives opened the email and began reading. The room shifted. Chairs squeaked. Fingers scrolled faster. The air grew heavier. And then I saw it. Eric's confident smile faltered. Just a fraction at first, but enough to notice. He glanced at Helen, then Mark, then back at the screen. He realized something was wrong. Something very, very wrong. He tried to continue speaking, but the words stumbled. Numbers he had presented with pride now looked fraudulent. The patterns were all there in the attachments I had included. Manipulated margins, inconsistent reporting, backdated edits, and worst of all, his attempts to shift blame onto me documented for everyone to see. He could no longer claim innocence. Every executive had the proof in front of them. What is this? Eric finally said, his voice rising but controlled, trying to mask panic with authority. This email, this data, this isn't accurate. Helen leaned forward, scanning the attachments. These are emails, Eric. Dates, instructions, manipulations, all time-stamped. Are you saying this is incorrect? He faltered. There must be a mistake. I didn't. Mark interrupted. No, Eric. These are your own directives, your edits. And you clearly instructed someone to change numbers without approval. You also blamed an employee for files she didn't touch. His face drained of color. For a man who thrived on control, this loss of command was devastating. He stumbled over his words, tried to explain, tried to redirect, but it was useless. Every piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered left him no escape. Every manipulated spreadsheet, every altered report, every time-stamped email was a nail in the coffin. And then it happened. He slipped. In a desperate attempt to defend himself, he accidentally admitted to one of the manipulations out loud. He didn't realize Helen was listening closely, nor that Mark had already made a note of it. He said, almost in a rush, well, yes, I did adjust the numbers, but I didn't. The words hung in the air. A confession. Unintentional. Complete. Irrefutable. The room went silent. I felt a thrill of vindication, but no gloating. Calm. Control. That's what this moment required. Calm. Eric's panic was now palpable. He was trying to salvage something, anything, but the damage was done. Upper management began whispering to each other, reviewing attachments, discussing next steps. The HR rep, Marjorie, who had previously dismissed me, sat frozen, suddenly realizing the magnitude of the situation. She glanced at Eric with alarm. He had overstepped every boundary, and now the entire company hierarchy was watching. I stayed seated at my desk, observing, noting the reactions. Some coworkers peeked over the partition, eyes wide, mouths slightly open in disbelief. A few of them, who had previously avoided me, now glanced with quiet admiration. No one spoke. No one dared. Everyone knew Eric's arrogance had finally met its match. Minutes stretched like hours. Eric tried to salvage his dignity, gesturing wildly, attempting to argue, to redirect attention, to manipulate the narrative, as he had done so many times before. But the more he spoke, the more entangled he became in his own lies. Every email, every screenshot, every single piece of documented proof countered his words immediately. Helen finally addressed him with a sharp, authoritative tone. Eric, we will need a formal explanation for this. And given the evidence, HR will be reviewing your conduct immediately. No further discussion until the board decides. He opened his mouth again, but Mark cut him off. The data doesn't lie. You've provided your own proof. There's no ambiguity here. And in that moment, I realized the weight of what I had done. Months of abuse, humiliation, and manipulation had led to this single convergence of timing, evidence, and strategy. The same man who had belittled me, who had made my life miserable every day, who had treated me like a disposable object, was now on the defensive, completely powerless, completely exposed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smirk. I didn't even breathe a sigh of relief. I simply leaned back and watched. I let the moment exist in all its gravity. The confrontation was over, even though the formal consequences had yet to unfold. By the end of the meeting, Eric had been escorted out by HR for an immediate internal investigation. Security discreetly followed him, ensuring no one interfered. Whispers filled the office corridors. Some coworkers stopped by my desk, offering subtle congratulations, eyes flickering with relief and awe. Others simply stared at the conference room doors, processing the fact that a man who had ruled their workspace through fear was suddenly gone, at least temporarily. And as I sat there, the months of humiliation, the sleepless nights, the anxiety, and the helplessness all seemed to collapse into one coherent reality. The person who had tried to destroy me had underestimated my patience, my resolve, and most importantly, my ability to see through his facade. I felt a quiet sense of justice, not loud or gloating, but deep and satisfying. I had survived. I had watched the wheels of karma, carefully constructed from cold logic and evidence, turn in my favor. Yet even as relief washed over me, I knew this wasn't the end. There would be fallout. There would be conversations. There would be explanations. But the power had shifted. The balance had tipped. And I was no longer the victim. The confrontation had happened. The trap had sprung, and for the first time in months, I felt free not just from his bullying, but from the fear that had haunted every moment since day one. I had faced him on the battlefield of truth, and I had won. After the confrontation in the boardroom, the office felt different, almost surreal. The hum of computers and low murmur of conversations carried a tension I hadn't felt before. Everyone knew something monumental had happened, even if they didn't yet know all the details. Eric wasn't gone forever, of course, but his aura of invincibility had vanished in minutes. It was as if someone had pulled back the curtain, revealing the man behind the mask, and no one could look at him the same way again. I returned to my desk slowly, heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened. Months of anxiety, humiliation, and sleepless nights had built to this exact moment, and now that it had arrived, the enormity of it left me almost breathless. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, though I had no real reason to type. I just needed to feel grounded, like the office was mine again, even if only in a small way. Alyssa, the quiet analyst who had first hinted at the possibility of proof against Eric, appeared at my side with a cautious smile. "I can't believe it," she whispered. He's actually been caught." I nodded slowly. "It's done. The proof was all there. He couldn't spin it, no matter how hard he tried. But the truth is, the real revelation came later that afternoon, in a way I hadn't expected. I was still reviewing files at my desk, making sure everything I had collected was backed up and organized, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from an unknown number. "You did the right thing. He's dangerous. Watch your back." I froze for a moment, staring at the screen. It wasn't threatening, but it was clear someone had been paying attention all along, someone who knew more than I did. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Somehow, just knowing that others were aware of his actions reinforced the gravity of what had been exposed. Then, around mid-afternoon, HR called me into a private office. Marjorie's face, usually a mask of corporate neutrality, was pale and tight. She gestured for me to sit. "We need to talk about what happened today," she said quietly, almost conspiratorially. I nodded, still trying to keep my composure. "Of course, I've already provided all the evidence, so I'm not sure what more you need." She shook her head. "It's not about more evidence. It's about what he said." "What did he say?" I asked, confused. Marjorie hesitated, then leaned forward. "He slipped. He confessed to someone in management, accidentally. He didn't realize anyone was listening. It was direct." I felt a chill run down my spine. What exactly?" "He admitted to the manipulations, the edits, the attempts to cover up mistakes, and get this, the plan to pin it all on you," she said. "He didn't mean to say it out loud, but he did. He exposed himself completely." I couldn't help but let out a small, disbelieving laugh. Months of meticulous planning, months of careful observation, and it all came together because he couldn't even control himself when under pressure. Even his arrogance had betrayed him. The realization settled in slowly. Everything he had done to humiliate me, to control me, to make me feel powerless, had been a fraud. And that fraud had crumbled because the truth is always stronger than lies when it's backed by evidence. By the end of the day, Eric had been called in for a full investigation. Executives were reviewing every single email, every document, every spreadsheet. HR was documenting his confession, cross-referencing it with the proof I had provided. And somewhere in that mix, I felt a strange mix of relief and vindication. Relief that I would no longer have to endure his bullying, and vindication that the man who had tried to break me would finally face accountability. But the real revelation wasn't just that he had been caught, it was what it revealed about him, and about the environment he had created. The office had been suffocating under his control. Everyone too afraid to speak up, everyone forced to follow a script that rewarded silence and punished honesty. I realized that by exposing him, I hadn't just defended myself. I had uncovered the cracks in a system that allowed this kind of behavior to flourish. Later, as I walked back to my desk, the weight of what had happened began began to settle. I felt lighter, but also more aware. I had survived months of psychological warfare, navigated manipulation, and emerged stronger. The helplessness that had consumed me just weeks ago was gone. In its place was clarity, confidence, a sense of control that I hadn't felt in a long time. And then came another, quieter moment of revelation, one that made the whole ordeal even more personal. As I was organizing my notes and emails, I noticed a small file Eric had left open on his desktop during the chaos of the meeting. Curiosity made me glance inside. It was a folder labeled with a date from last year, and inside were emails and documents outlining similar manipulations, the same patterns I had discovered about the current quarter. He had done this before. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a pattern, a repeated method of control and deception. That realization hit me harder than anything else. It wasn't just about my experience, it was about the kind of man Eric truly was, and how many others had likely suffered silently before me. But there was also something empowering in knowing that history had finally caught up with him. The past, he thought he could bury in secrecy, was now fully exposed, and the consequences were unavoidable. He had underestimated patience, observation, and the meticulous collection of truth. He had overestimated his invincibility, his ability to manipulate, and his control over the narrative. By the end of the day, I left the office with a sense of closure that I hadn't anticipated. The tension, the fear, the humiliation, they were all still memories, but they were memories now framed by action and accountability. The man who had dominated my life for months was no longer untouchable. The tables had turned, and the truth had won. As I walked through the parking garage, the evening air hitting my face, I reflected on how much I had endured. The helplessness, the anxiety, the constant monitoring, the public humiliation, they had all been part of a process that ultimately led to empowerment. The slip, the accidental confession, the revelation, it wasn't luck. It was the result of observation, preparation, and resilience. I realized that sometimes, the smallest details, an offhand comment, a misdirected glance, a minor slip could unravel even the most carefully constructed faade. And I had been ready. I had seen it. I had acted. And that was the difference between victimhood and victory. By the time I reached my car, I knew that nothing about my work environment would ever be the same. Not just because Eric's reign had ended, but because I had changed. I was no longer the person who could be intimidated, controlled, or humiliated into silence. I had learned how to navigate deception, how to document truth, and how to act decisively when the moment arrived. And somewhere deep inside, I also realized that Eric's slip wasn't just the confirmation of my suspicions, it was a gift. His arrogance, his overconfidence, his belief that no one was watching, had handed me the proof I needed to end months of fear and manipulation in one decisive move. The next morning, the office had a strange, almost electric energy. Everyone knew something had shifted, but no one was entirely sure how to navigate it. Conversations were hushed, glances more meaningful, and even the usual hum of computers felt different, as if the air itself had been recalibrated. Eric's office remained empty, a glaring reminder of the power vacuum he had left behind, and a subtle symbol of the reckoning he had brought upon himself. By mid-morning, HR had completed a preliminary review of all evidence. Executives convened in a special session to discuss the implications. It was the kind of meeting I had once feared attending, the one where mistakes were magnified and careers were decided. But now, as I watched from a distance, I realized the fear had shifted. The man who had wielded intimidation for months was now the subject of scrutiny, and I was no longer powerless. Helen, the senior executive, addressed the room with sharp precision. We have clear evidence of deliberate manipulation and misconduct. This affects not only performance metrics but also employee trust. We cannot ignore the scale of this behavior. Her gaze was steady, no room for misinterpretation. The room nodded in agreement, the weight of her authority undeniable. Mark, the finance head, added, all documented changes, emails, and timestamps corroborate the narrative presented. Attempts to shift blame are invalid. The individual responsible must face immediate consequences. I watched quietly as murmurs of realization rippled through the remaining staff. Some glanced at me, subtle acknowledgments in their eyes. It was almost surreal. Months of suffering had led to this validation. A reversal of every humiliating moment Eric had inflicted upon me. When Eric was finally called back into the office, escorted by HR, his demeanor had completely shifted. The arrogance that once filled the room was gone. He walked with a quiet, almost tentative step, clearly aware that the tables had turned. No longer did he dominate space with overconfidence. Now, every gesture seemed calculated, defensive, cautious. The confrontation was formal, but the outcome was unmistakable. Eric was suspended pending a full internal investigation. Every misstep, every alteration of numbers, every attempt to scapegoat others would be reviewed. And this time, the executives weren't buying excuses or manufactured justifications. The evidence was airtight, and the narrative was undeniable. The power dynamic within the office shifted immediately. For the first time, employees no longer approached their work with the same apprehension. Conversations became less guarded, smiles more genuine, and meetings more collaborative. The fear that Eric had cultivated evaporated, replaced by a subtle but undeniable sense of safety and fairness. For me, the shift was deeper than the professional realm. It wasn't just that Eric faced consequences. It was that I had reclaimed control over my life and my work. Months of anxiety, humiliation, and helplessness had been transformed into experience, awareness, and ultimately power. The validation of truth over manipulation had reinforced a personal sense of justice I hadn't felt before. Even more revealing was watching Eric's attempts to regain composure fail. He tried to explain, tried to justify, tried to project confidence, but each effort crumbled under the weight of incontrovertible evidence. His colleagues, who once trembled under his scrutiny, now observed quietly, not needing to act, but knowing that the imbalance had ended. The final twist came when the executive board recommended a formal disciplinary action, termination. There was no debate, no ambiguity, no chance for him to recover his standing. Months of intimidation, lies, and abuse culminated in a decisive moment where accountability overtook arrogance. I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't gloat. The satisfaction was quiet, deep, personal. Watching the man who had spent months destroying my confidence and my reputation finally face the consequences of his own actions was validation enough. I had endured, I had observed, and I had acted strategically. The scales had finally been balanced. In the days that followed, the office gradually returned to routine, but the lesson remained palpable. Authority without accountability can crumble. Manipulation, no matter how carefully orchestrated, will eventually meet its match when confronted with patience, observation, and documented truth. The power shift wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming space, dignity, and respect. And for me, it was a profound affirmation of resilience and strategy. Weeks later, as I settled into the new rhythm of the office, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. The months of fear, humiliation, and helplessness had been transformative, forcing me to observe, analyze, and prepare in ways I hadn't imagined. What had once seemed insurmountable, the constant scrutiny, the public ridicule, the emotional manipulation, had become the catalyst for my own empowerment. Colleagues who had once avoided me now approached with quiet respect. They had witnessed not just the downfall of Eric, but the resilience it took to endure months of abuse without losing one's sense of self. The atmosphere, once heavy and tense, was now lighter, more collaborative, and infused with a cautious optimism. Trust, once eroded, was slowly being rebuilt. Reflecting on the confrontation itself, I realized how pivotal the slip had been. Eric's accidental confession, combined with the meticulously gathered evidence, had created a moment that could not be denied or manipulated. It was a stark reminder that even the most calculated individuals are vulnerable to their own flaws, and that awareness and preparedness can turn apparent weakness into decisive strength. The aftermath extended beyond professional consequences. Personally, I felt a profound shift in confidence. I understood now that endurance is not passive. It is active. It is strategic. It requires patience, observation, and calculated action. Every moment of fear had been a lesson in perception. Every act of humiliation had strengthened my resolve, and every attempt to intimidate had ultimately provided the insight I needed to reclaim power. There was also a subtle, yet important, emotional closure. The anxiety that had shadowed my daily life slowly dissipated. I no longer flinched at unexpected emails or sudden requests. I no longer questioned my competence or my worth. The experience had crystallized into a clear understanding. Control is not about submission, it's about awareness and action. And in that sense, the lessons I learned were invaluable. I also realized the broader impact of the events. By exposing Eric, I had indirectly given a voice to others who had suffered silently. His removal and the subsequent restructuring of authority sent a clear message: manipulation and abuse will not be tolerated. Integrity, evidence, and accountability matter more than intimidation. The ripple effects of one individual's courage can transform an entire environment.